Shall I get us started?
I think so. We've got, yeah, 38 people over to fell.
Cool. Yeah. So I wanted to give a talk about metaprogramming and specifically around my thoughts that you should probably metaprogram like you are ashamed of it. Um, I wanted to start out by sort of defining what metaprogramming is in case people have not actually got a definition of that. There's a lot of things that get called metaprogramming, and some things are metaprogramming, some things aren't. And so I thought it'd be good to make sure we're all on the same page as to what it is that I'm talking about. And metaprogramming is when a computer program can use a computer program as data. And it can be the program itself, it can be a different program. A linter is a kind of metaprogramming, for example, because it will look at a computer program as a computer program and make decisions based on it. Generally, metaprogramming tends to be used to refer to programs that write themselves at runtime, but it is broader than that as a concept. Um, it's also worth sort of knowing what I mean by computer program for the purposes of that, which is just instructions that tell a computer what to do. Um, I'm not going to continue down this definition path and tell you what a computer is, um, but a computer program is just the instructions that tell a computer what to do. So I'm going to start out with some like high level examples and ask if you think they're metaprogramming. Um, I've tried to include JavaScript examples to start with. I have not continued to include JavaScript examples the whole way through because I haven't written JavaScript in anger in more than half a decade, and I don't think that my JavaScript is necessarily up to modern standards as a result. So it will become more Ruby as it goes on, but we'll start with both. Um, do people think that this defining behavior at runtime is metaprogramming? Here we have the Ruby defining a method. Here we have use of a proxy to override the get handler for um, this particular like thing. Is that is that meta programming? Just give me like a thumbs up if you think that it is. I got some like, isn't that what Def Hello World does? Yeah, kind of in a way, except that this is going to be taking this argument and this is the computer program that you are running. So this is an individual set of like computer programming, and this is like the defined method side. Um, I had an original version that sort of had more complex stuff, but I wanted to make it more accessible to people. So yeah, that is metaprogramming when you are at runtime defining new functionalities. Um, Interpreted languages at runtime make this more complicated because there is a reasonable argument that any language that isn't compiled is kind of all metaprogramming. Um, but I'm trying to stick to the more commonly used versions of the term rather than the like actually version of the explanation. Um, is accessing the properties of an object metaprogramming? So we have some property being set up here, and we call foo on it, and we get back bar. And similarly in JavaScript, we have foo bar, and we call foo on it, and we get bar. Do we think that's metaprogramming? No, big no from Murad. Um, yeah, accessing a property is not metaprogramming, but there is a slight caveat here, which is that like the process of creating the property dynamically is metaprogramming. The internals of those things, the things that set up those functions for you, those are metaprogramming. We didn't do any of those. We used metaprogramming, but we didn't ourselves do any metaprogramming, and that's an important thing to understand as a difference. Do ORMs use programming? ORMs, for people who don't know, it's object resource mapping. It is generally a commonly used pattern for communicating with a database on a server. Things like user.first, account.name, subscription.duration. Do these use metaprogramming? I have an enthusiastic yes from several people there, which is lovely. Um, yeah. many ORMs rely on metaprogramming to create the functions that allow you to interact with the database dynamically. And while like calling them again, we're not doing the metaprogramming. The ORMs definitely use metaprogramming as a very standard practice for setting things up. Is it easier to understand what some of these examples do than others? Is it simpler to know the behavior of like user.subscriptions versus define method or accessing a proxy in JavaScript? We had again a quick yes there from Chris, which I appreciate. This is mostly a matter of opinion, but I do think that some of these things are simpler and more intuitive than others. It's a matter of like personal taste, but and experience interacting with those things, but I do think some of them are simpler and easier to understand than others. And so kind of what I want to talk about is what makes good metaprogramming, what makes metaprogramming that is more easy to interact with. Because we've seen some of these very like core concepts use metaprogramming, although we're not actually doing metaprogramming ourselves. So we can think about them in terms of like what makes them as metaprogramming that we're engaging with good to use. And I think the answer is shame. I think they are ashamed of what they are inside and they are trying to hide it from the world. And I think that's a good thing. The best metaprogramming is metaprogramming that you'll never see. So the internals of the service result object that I mentioned earlier contains this method that sets up the methods that allow you to access the extra inside the service result. I didn't even mention the extra when I was setting up the object because it's all done with metaprogramming, but we define singleton methods on the service result that are equal to the value. And in using it, you don't have to know why it might be important to guard against extra not being a hash. You don't have to think about the fact that it will only define methods that don't already exist, so you don't accidentally override like success question mark on a service result. These are like hidden away from us. To use another example that we see used sometimes in the Ruby code base, I have cropped this because it's too long and complicated otherwise, and I'm not expecting you to understand it. This is part of the internals of memory, which is a gem that we use for memoizing the results of individual methods. It's quite complicated. There's quite a lot going on here, and I wouldn't expect anyone to be able to, at a glance, understand what's going to happen. And that's kind of the point. We don't ever think about that when we use memory. For anyone who has never used it, you just say memoize before the method definition and it just works. It just does the things that you want it to do and you don't have to think about it. And I think that's a really good example of metaprogramming. And I want to talk about metaprogramming as it exists in Rails as a sort of larger example of this. Rails will, as an ORM, load the database and define methods for you based on that database. So we have things like user.name, account.balance, subscription.state. These are not methods that we have definitions of in the codebase. We don't say anywhere in the codebase, I want to go and look at the database when I am asking about a user's name or an account's balance. That's just something that Rails provides to us and we make use of. So that is a meta programming that Rails does on our behalf. And similarly, Rails lets you define relationships with code. So by this, I mean things like user.accounts, account.included transactions, subscription.successful payments. These are relationships between objects, which we define in code, but again, we're not defining these methods directly. There isn't a def accounts somewhere in the user class. It's set up by Rails with a whole load of additional considerations that we just never have to think about when we are creating relationships between objects using Rails as an ORM. And Rails gives you a clean DSL to configure it. And that's where we are giving the inputs to like Rails's meta programming. DSL being domain specific language, if you're like no more acronyming me as we go. So that's that stuff like has many users. So this would be Why you can do account.users is we have at some point done has many users. That does a whole lot of things that you don't need to worry about if you're just trying to set up a simple relationship between things, and that's great. It's great that you can do that so densely. Similarly, we have things like validation. Yes, def method name returns the value of the method name, and in fact, if you define a class, it returns the last symbol of the last method defined in that class, unless you've done something else. Yeah, so we have validations as well, where this will validate that amount is present, which means that it is a non-blank value. It's not empty and it's not nil. And we don't need to think about how that happens and sort of when that happens. It's just when it needs to validate, it will do these validations. And then we have a slightly more complicated one where we have scopes. So this we might have like subscriptions dot ending before, and we give it a date, and it goes and queries the database and it says, I want things where the end at is up to but not including that date. So ending before then. And that is a really handy way to be able to describe things. And we don't have to write that method ourselves. We don't have to think about the chainability of scopes. We don't have to think about how they combine. It just works for us. And so then you get to the question that I sort of alluded to earlier, which is like, am I always metaprogramming when I use Rails? And I don't think so. Not in the sense that most people mean it, at least. Rails is using metaprogramming to provide you the methods that you need to use, but just using those methods is not itself metaprogramming. At least not in the way most people use that word. So I said that you should act like you're ashamed of metaprogramming, and I didn't really like talk about what shame means to me and like why I think you should have it. So I think shame basically comes down to like a few things. I think it's a simple interface. I think it is hidden internal complexity. I think it's an accessible implementation. I think it's being mindful of the intended use cases of your metaprogramming. And I think it's an extensible design. I think it's being able to add more things without it horribly breaking in unexpected ways. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about like why I think this kind of shame is useful. A simple interface is really important because you want your thing to be easy to use. It should be intuitive and it should be friendly to engage with. You don't want somebody to have to know how everything works in order to be able to use it. And just reading it the first time should make it obvious. We don't teach people anything about the internals of how an ORM works. We just say the database column exists and you can just access it by calling this method. And it can be years before it even occurs to somebody to go, and how does that work actually? And it's quick to update when you're copying code. I think it's very normal for people to copy code from other places in order to reuse it. And if the interface is simple, it's very easy to see which parts you should change. If you can't remember the exact syntax of a scope, it's very simple to copy a scope that's sort of like what you want and replace the innards with something that you actually need. And I think it is really useful to be able to have that like ease of change. In terms of the hidden internal complexity, I think it's really useful that there are no signs of how simple or complex the implementation is. Some of the examples I've used today are like maybe 10, 15 lines of metaprogramming. Some of the internals of Rails are tens of thousands of lines of code that will get run when you do a simple individual line. And you don't need to know which is which. It's not necessary to understand how complex what you're doing is in order for doing it to be useful to you. And part of that is that no signs of the internals should leak through the interface. When you're interacting with things, particularly in Rails, Rails does a lot of work to try and avoid you needing to know specifically how the internals works. Sometimes you do get some objects needing to come out from the interface. For example, if you have a collection of objects in Rails, that is a collection, a kind of Railsy thing that represents a group of objects. But in most cases, it kind of interacts like an array, and you don't really need to know that it isn't an array. If you treat it like an array, it will work the way you expect. And that's great. It's really good that where it doesn't need to, the internals are not visible to you, and you don't need to know how to do like active record inflections because they're an internal concept. And if you've never heard of that, that's by design. It's because you've never needed to know. And this means making deliberate decisions about what you should expose. Which things that are your internal concepts are results of somebody interacting with your metaprogramming, and which things are catalysts, things that will be used in the process but never given out as an end result. And then we also have this idea of an accessible implementation. That means it should be relatively easy to get under the hood. One of the things that I find very challenging with metaprogramming, and this is where we start to look at why how metaprogramming is useful to more experienced developers who are engaging with it, people who are likely to want to understand what exactly it's doing and why. If the first thing your metaprogramming does is invoke half a dozen concepts that nobody's heard of outside of your domain, it's immediately difficult to understand what's happening and why. That first level inside whatever interface you provide, I feel should be a friendly interface. It should be useful to think about if somebody wants to understand how this works, am I going to scare them immediately by when they look at this, or is it going to be understandable? And this means making sure that your top level concepts make sense quickly, even though you're not expecting most people to look. You should still consider that some people will, because some people are never going to be satisfied with, ooh, it does the thing that I need it to do. Some people are always going to want to know why, even if they don't need to. And I sort of want you to consider curious developers when you're doing this kind of meta programming, because like as somebody who primarily learns through like lifting the hood and prodding things, I find it so much more helpful when somebody has clearly thought about what I'm going to see when I do that versus opening it up and being like, nothing here is labeled, everything is an internal concept, and everything is kind of named almost the exact same thing as everything else. And that's very confusing. And in terms of being mindful of different kinds of developer, it's also being like deliberate about your intended use cases. So the interface should support your intended use case as well. If there is a normal thing for your metaprogramming to do, doing that thing should be really easy. Ideally, it should take as close to zero effort as possible. And it should be easy to understand the limitations, the things it doesn't do. This can be as simple as saying like this doesn't support this sort of thing as a comment around the definitions of your interface. It is really useful for people to know what you wanted it to do and what you didn't want it to do. And that doesn't mean that doing the things that you don't want it to do is bad. Somebody else might want to do that, but they need to know your thing isn't going to support it, particularly if you've got this complex interface where there's a lot of possible ways you could have exposed some functionality to a user. And I think it's really important to document what it does and doesn't do internally. For something like Rails, this documentation is external and public because it is something we're hoping that people will use. But I think it's very important for metaprogramming to have this kind of documentation around it, even if it is just comments explaining it, because I think why something is the way it is a really important thing that comments can explain. And it's particularly important when it comes to meta programming, where the inputs are going to actually define the behavior. We don't know at the time we're reading the meta programming code what it's going to do because it's only going to do it based on the program the meta programming has been provided. And I sort of mentioned this earlier a little bit as well. I think you should try and consider an extensible design. I think it should be designed for people to use it in new ways. This relates very strongly to not accidentally exposing your internal objects to people who use it, because it means that if your interface is clean, people can wrap things around it of their own use, and that can be really powerful. And it also means a clear signposting of what things can and can't be changed. If you want to change how Rails generates its error messages for validations, you can find documentation of how to do that, how to provide new strings to use for that, how to internationalize those messages. That's something that Rails wants you to be able to change. If you wanted to change the fundamentals of how collections worked in Rails, I would expect an experienced Rails developer could spend several months on trying to make a comprehensive change to how collections works, and I think they still probably wouldn't be confident that it would work in all cases. There are some things that you should be able to change and some things you shouldn't, and it's really useful to explain to people who are using your system which things are which. Oh, went a little bit too far there. And also, any exposed objects should be as simple as possible. And this doesn't mean they can't have complex behavior in them. It means that wherever possible, they should be or act like simple things. I talked about active record collections because I think they're a great example of this. They are an enumerable thing that you can iterate over, and if you are taught it's basically an array, and then you treat it like an array, you will not find it has much surprising behavior until you start to really get into the like specifics and the weeds of how it behaves. I think trying to use core concepts that already exist in whichever frameworks you're using where possible, and where that's not possible, trying to add as little as possible to what you return is a really important way to make sure it's extensible. Because if you return an array of things, that's always going to be easier to work with than something that is your own custom idea of a collection. Sometimes you will need to have additional things, but avoid it if you can. So next time you are doing some meta programming, I would like you to remember, if you can, to have some shame. Um, thank you very much.
Amazing. Cheers for that, Fel. I guess if you're open to it, Fel, if anyone's got any questions, I didn't see any
Yeah, I'm open to
questions.
it.
There's some good dialogue in the chat, but I don't think any questions popping up. Um, Jake,
Um, yeah, I love those points. I guess my question is, what makes those specific to metaprogramming as opposed to just programming in all cases?
I don't think they're necessarily specific to meta programming. I just think meta programming sort of intensifies the need for these kinds of deliberate decision making because it's not obvious a lot of the time what it's actually going to do. Um, there is a degree of complexity that comes from having to have your behavior defined by something outside of the code that you're writing that leads to, for me at least, an extra layer of difficulty thinking about things. There is a real challenge to when your inputs are complex versus when your inputs are simple. If you have a method that's if you have a function that's going to be manipulating strings, it can be a lot easier to think about than if you've got something that's going to receive something that will do something to a string, and then you're using that manipulator of strings yourself and altering its behavior as metaprogramming.
Thank you.
If that example was confusing, that's why. Do we have any more questions? Um, Ed is suggesting the meta programming Ruby book, which is, yeah, very approachable and very good. Ruby is a very meta programming friendly language. Probably the most meta programming friendly language that I've worked in great detail with.
would you say shame lives harmoniously alongside solid, or is there some healthy friction at any of those points?
Mm, I think I think there's definitely some friction at some points of it. I think for me, solid is a generalized concept or set of concepts that are usable everywhere, And I feel that like for metaprogramming in particular, it's mostly this idea of like internal complexity that can be less clear, I find, in Solid at times.
Mm.
Like, a lot of software design principles are around like we should avoid complexity where we can and make things as simple as possible. And a lot of metaprogramming is, okay, I just need to do something really fiddly, and this is going to be very dense.
Mm.
And it can be beneficial for metaprogramming to be very dense in terms of its behavior because you're not expecting people mostly to have to engage with those parts of your program.
Mm.
And that's something that is rarely, or at least I've not found it described neatly in a lot of software design principles, is these areas of code that can be like very high, I'm going to say very high entropy. They can be very complex and very like uh confusing because broadly you're not expecting that people will need to go there. I do think it's nice to try and make it accessible wherever you can, but sometimes it's okay if, like I used the example of memory there, memory does a lot of complicated things that you never need to worry about when you're using it, and that's fine. It's not expecting you to change it, it's expecting you to use it as it is.
Nice. Nice. That makes sense. Thank you. Any more questions for Phil? I'm sure he's more than happy if you want to drop him a DM or a
Yeah, absolutely.
message. Oh, seeing Christoph, over to you.
Yeah, just wanted to make sure you came up with shame yourself, or did someone else use this acronym for that before?
I don't know of anyone else using this acronym. I actually had an idea of the general like concepts, um, and was writing the talk to explain the like hiding of internal complexity in the simple interface and things like that. And then as I was thinking about it, was like, oh, I can actually do, I can do an acrostic with this, and like some of these are like a little more like crowbarred in than others. But I was like, it actually like fits pretty well, so I'm gonna do it because it's fun, and I'm a sucker for whimsy.
Yeah, I think it matches perfectly, and also there's the element of surprise there, so love it.
Cool, thank you.